The Italian Renaissance is often celebrated as the moment Europe awoke from its medieval slumber, a luminous era defined by the rediscovery of classical philosophy, the flourishing of humanism, and the triumph of artistic genius. Yet, to view this period solely through the lens of patronage and artistic freedom is to ignore the profound intellectual fragility that defined the age. The Renaissance was not merely a time of creation, it was a brutal proving ground for ideas, a contest where the ultimate stakes were the very existence of a document. The archive of 15th century Florence was, in effect, a silent battlefield, where the tools of war were not cannons and steel, but ink, vellum, and the moral choices of those who wielded them. Florence, a city of contradictions. Florence was the beating heart of this paradox. It was the home of the powerful Medici family, whose immense wealth funded the revolutionary art of Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo, and whose libraries contained texts deemed too radical just a century earlier. Yet, this liberal environment existed under the constant threat of theological and political reaction. The rise of figures like Girolamo Savonarola, the Dominican friar who gripped the city in the 1490s, exposed the thin veneer of secular humanism. Savonarola's movement, culminating in the notorious bonfire of the vanities, was a mass campaign of archival erasure. Art, books, musical instruments, and anything deemed sinful or pagan were publicly incinerated. For the historical record, this event was catastrophic. It taught a chilling lesson. Knowledge was not permanent. It was subject to the whims of political and spiritual power. It demonstrated that the archive was not a neutral repository, but an instrument of control. A historian's primary source was a censor's primary target. This context of volatile religious extremism and rapid political turnover is the backdrop against which our central figure, the copyist, made her monumental choice. The copyist, the gatekeeper of collective learning. To understand Sister Maddalena's significance, we must first appreciate the infrastructure of knowledge reproduction in the late medieval and Renaissance period. Before the widespread use of the printing press, the scriptorium, often located within powerful convents or monasteries, was the primary engine of collective learning. These were the intellectual factories of Europe, where anonymous scribes performed the tireless, repetitive, and essential work of mass duplication. Sister Maddalena was one of these indispensable workers. Her life was characterized by a meticulous routine, preparing vellum, mixing ink, ruling lines, and copying texts word for word, sometimes for 12 hours a day, under vows of silence. She was, in the most literal sense, a gatekeeper of the archive. Her authority stemmed not from her scholarly renown, but from her trustworthiness and technical expertise. She was not merely duplicating texts, she was authenticating them, verifying their consistency, and deciding which fragile piece of incoming knowledge was worth the hundreds of hours of labor required for copying, and which was to be discarded or repurposed. Crucially, Maddalena held the power of negative preservation. When political or religious winds changed, her responsibilities extended to pre-censorship, the act of screening incoming or outgoing documents and deciding which should be destroyed before their existence could become a liability to the institution or its patrons. This made the copyist's chair the most important and perhaps the most dangerous seat in the library. The true archive of the Renaissance was not just what was saved, but what Maddalena and her peers tacitly allowed to disappear. Her proximity to this machinery of erasure gave her the precise knowledge of how to subvert it. The act of hiding the forbidden text was therefore not a random impulse, but a calculated archival procedure performed by an expert who understood the physics of control. The fragility of the vellum, the material constraints of the era further amplified the importance of the copyist's role. Vellum, prepared animal hide, was expensive, time-consuming to create, and precious. Every square inch of the archive represented a significant economic investment. This financial reality ensured that only the most highly valued knowledge was preserved. Maddalena, dealing with this resource scarcity daily, knew the value of the paper she held and understood that to destroy a large, dense manuscript was to destroy years of labor and hundreds of florins of materials. Her decision to save the astronomical treatise was thus a triple defiance: defiance of the church, defiance of the political climate, and defiance of the practical economic imperative to discard a text deemed useless. This intellectual environment, where genius coexisted with the threat of the pyre, and where the silent worker held veto power over the continuation of the historical record, sets the stage for an extraordinary act of individual archival heroism. When historians uncover documents from the past, the true measure of their importance is not their physical size, but the density of the ideas they contain. In the context of late 15th century Florence, the astronomical manuscript that came into Sister Madalena's possession was not threatening because of its revolutionary science, though it was certainly that, but because of its theological and sociological consequences. The paper held not merely a geometric correction, but an existential threat to the entire medieval worldview, making its destruction a religious and political imperative for the censors. The geocentric consensus: for over 15 centuries, the intellectual and spiritual life of Europe had been anchored by the Ptolemaic geocentric model of the cosmos. This model, synthesized with Christian theology, placed the earth, and by extension humanity and God's creation, at the fixed, unmoving center of the universe. This placement was the foundation of the established order. Theological hierarchy. Humanity's centrality was proof of God's specific love and focus. The heavens were arranged neatly in concentric, crystalline spheres leading out to the Empyrean heaven, the realm of God. This structure supported the hierarchy of the church and the spiritual meaning of life. Practical utility. The model provided a functioning, if complex, framework for timekeeping, navigation, and astrology, which was then crucial for medicine and agriculture. Philosophical authority. It upheld the authority of Aristotle and the great Greek philosophers whose work had been carefully integrated into Christian dogma. To challenge the geocentric model was not merely a scientific error, it was a cosmic disruption. It challenged the literal interpretation of Scripture, the authority of the Church Fathers, and the very stability of the social and spiritual order. The manuscript in question, a Proto-Copernican text, dared to suggest a devastatingly simple solution to the complex, clumsy epicycles that Ptolemy required to make the cosmos work. The text proposed that the seemingly erratic motions of the planets could be solved if one postulated that the Earth itself was in motion, revolving around the Sun. This insight, later formalized by Copernicus, was a direct assault on the geocentric archive. It suggested that Earth was just another celestial body, shifting the focus of creation away from the human drama and placing it onto abstract mathematical principles. For a censor operating during the puritanical climate of the Savonarolan era, this document was not an academic curiosity, it was heresy by geometry. The text could not be reasoned with or debated. It had to be obliterated. Its existence in the archive was proof that dangerous, destabilizing thoughts were infiltrating the heart of Catholic intellectual life. The text was therefore subject to immediate and absolute archival eradication, a sentence Maddalena was responsible for executing. The personal conflict of the keeper. Sister Maddalena was an expert in the material culture of knowledge. She spent her days preserving the texts that defined the known world. The arrival of the forbidden manuscript placed her in a profound, quiet conflict. On one side stood the powerful, immediate authority of her convent and the dominant religious fervor demanding destruction. On the other stood the silent authority of the text itself, a clear, logical argument that explained the observable world better than any authorized script. Her choice was one between duty and the preservation of truth.
To destroy the manuscript was to uphold the temporary yet violent power structure of her time. To save it was to risk her life and the reputation of her institution for the sake of an abstract, dangerous, yet compelling idea. This decision illuminates the deep ethical responsibility inherent in archival work. The archivist must sometimes choose fidelity to the evidence over obedience to the state. The significance of the moment was that this was a knowledge bottleneck. If Madalena failed, this manuscript's chain of collective learning would be broken. Decades of unique astronomical observation and mathematical insight would vanish, forcing future generations to repeat the work and delaying the scientific revolution. The battle for the future of knowledge was being fought not in a grand lecture hall, but in the small, silent scriptorium of Santa Maria degli Angeli.
The act of defiance, executed by Sister Maddalena, was not an impulsive rebellion. It was an act of extraordinary archival engineering. To successfully hide a large, controversial manuscript for 5 centuries required not luck, but a profound understanding of 15th century book construction, institutional blind spots, and the physics of preservation. Her plan was an exercise in structural camouflage. The chosen prison, the Vitae Sanctorum, or Lives of the Saints, was Maddalena's choice of the host volume, was the first and most critical strategic decision. The target volume had to meet specific criteria to guarantee the smuggled manuscript's survival. Size and authority. It had to be massive, a folio or large quarto, to provide ample physical space within the spine structure. The Vitae Sanctorum was a book of immense doctrinal authority, large enough to be shelved with the great legal and religious codices. Censors rarely handle the most authoritative volumes, assuming their contents are sacrosanct and beyond reproach. The Vitae was the perfect, boring, and therefore safe archive. Usage pattern. The book had to be frequently accessed, yet never closely examined. The Vitae was essential for sermons and daily readings, ensuring it was consistently preserved and maintained by the library. If the host book were a curiosity, it might be forgotten and left to rot. If it were too revolutionary, it would face the same fate as the hidden text. The Vitae was the perfect, boring, and therefore safe archive. Physical integrity. A newly rebound or heavily repaired volume was ideal. Its spine structure would be robust, capable of accommodating the added bulk without immediately failing, and its recent refurbishment would deter immediate future conservation work that might expose the contents. The engineering of the spine. The hiding process was a technical challenge that relied on Maddalena's expertise as a copyist and bookbinder. 15th century bindings were highly specialized, relying on wooden boards, heavy leather, and strong sewing supports. The spine was a complex structure of layered materials, and Maddalena utilized its anatomy for her purpose. Preparation of the codices. She first had to ensure the heretical manuscript was stable. It was likely a roll or small codex. She would have had to carefully flatten the pages, perhaps applying a thin starch paste for stability, and then trimming the margins perfectly to fit the hidden space. Disassembly and integration. Maddalena would have carefully removed the wooden boards and peeled back the leather covering the spine of the Vitae. Instead of merely stuffing the pages inside, which would cause noticeable bulging, she stitched the manuscript directly into the core support system, the leather thongs and sewing threads that hold the host book's signatures together. This made the forbidden text a literal structural component of the Holy One. The sealing and camouflage. The final step was resealing the spine with fresh glue and reapplying the leather, using pressure to ensure the new component was fully integrated.
The subtle staining of the leather, noted by modern conservators, confirms that the acidic iron gall ink of the hidden manuscript slowly bled into the protective layers over centuries, a chemical signature of its long imprisonment. This physical act of preservation turned the book into a Trojan horse of knowledge. It was an act of high-stakes forgery, where the copyist used her intimate knowledge of archival construction to cheat the system designed to monitor her. She understood that if a censor ever opened the Vitae Sanctorum, they would see only approved text and a robust, unmolested spine. Her technical skill rendered the dangerous knowledge physically and ideologically invisible. Her defiance was successful because it was not emotional, but systemic. She used the rules and materials of the archive against the authorities who enforced them.
The historical record rarely rewards patience as generously as it did with the rediscovery of Sister Maddalena's hidden manuscript. After nearly 5 centuries of silence, the heretical text survived the decay of time, the threat of fire, and multiple waves of institutional purging. The final act of this archival drama, the discovery, the reading of the copyist's signature, and the assessment of its impact is a testament to the long game played by Maddalena and the value of meticulous preservation. The modern revelation. The astronomical text was not found by accident, but by the modern discipline of conservation science. In the late 20th century, a team of conservators was tasked with stabilizing the largest and most valuable books in the convent's collection. Conservators, unlike historians, are trained to look past the content and focus on the structure, the glue, the vellum tension, and the stitching. During a routine examination, a conservator noted that the Vitae Sanctorum exhibited an inexplicable stiffness and disproportionate weight for its page count. This anomaly, the failure of the book's physics to match its contents, triggered a more invasive inspection. Using non-destructive imaging, like X-ray or specialized light, they confirmed the presence of organic material sewn deep within the spine. The dismantling was slow and agonizing, performed with the full understanding that the act of recovery risked destroying the fragile hidden text. What they found was the remarkable Proto-Copernican manuscript, perfectly preserved, its ink having left the faint chemical ghost on the surrounding materials that had been noticed earlier. Decoding the archival signature. The recovery of the manuscript only solved half the puzzle. Why was it there? Was it accidental? The answer lay in the subtle, coded communication Maddalena left behind, the marginalia on the Vitae Sanctorum's end papers. Maddalena was a copyist, and a copyist communicates primarily through textual references, dates, and script styles. Her secret journal was not a long, dramatic confession, but a series of cryptic micro-inscriptions placed in the blank, non-textual areas of the book, the end papers and flyleaves. These included a cursive date, a precise date coinciding with the peak of the Savannah-Roland purges, archival initials, a familiar cipher or initial unique to her use in the scriptorium records, a positional note, a geometrically phrased instruction, possibly a mnemonic device linking the hidden document's subject to a specific page or line number in the host book that discusses the creation of the heavens. These minuscule, almost invisible markings served as Maddalena's archival signature. They established 3 critical facts. The action was intentional, it was taken during a specific crisis period, and it was performed by a person with expert knowledge of the archive's internal cataloging system. She didn't just hide the text, she cataloged the fact that it was hidden, leaving a defiant instruction for any future scholar with the eyes to see it. The echo of defiance in collective learning. The importance of Maddalena's act transcends her personal heroism. It lies in the concept of temporal knowledge transfer. When the scientific revolution began in earnest, thinkers like Copernicus and later Galileo often struggled to demonstrate the antiquity and intellectual validity of their ideas, frequently facing accusations of inventing heresy rather than rediscovering truth.
The recovered manuscript proved that the fundamental conceptual leap, the moving earth, was not a sudden 16th century fabrication, but a rediscovered tradition that existed as a continuous, albeit persecuted, thread in Western thought. Maddalena's choice ensured that a decade of observation, calculation, and critical thought did not fall out of the collective learning memory bank. Her single, silent act provided crucial intellectual lineage and authority to the revolutionary ideas that eventually redefined humanity's place in the cosmos. The legacy of the copyist who hid the dawn is a powerful reminder that history is not a record of what was created, but a record of what was saved. The continued success of human endeavor rests entirely upon the integrity of the archival chain, which, in critical moments, is often guarded by the quiet defiance of a single vigilant individual.